which I just described a moment ago, which are so fundamental, got us to thinking about the evolutionary basis of social networks themselves. Human social networks, whenever they have been mapped, look strikingly similar, like the pictures I've shown you so far. They all look kind of like the images that I've shown you, but they never look like this. They never look like a regular lattice, like a sodium chloride crystal. We do not, as human beings, form networks that have this structure. Why not? I mean, why don't our social lives look like this, where we occupy a world in which everyone has the same number of friends and no one is more central or peripheral than anyone else? Everyone is just in exactly the same location. Well, the striking patterns of human social networks, their ubiquity, and their apparent purpose beg the question of whether we evolved to have them and to have particular kinds of social networks. So now the questions became, why do we form networks in the first place, and why do they have the structure that they do? And to understand this, we need to digress for just a moment and dissect network structure just a little bit. Notice that every position in this network is like every other position in the network. But that's not the case with natural social networks. So if you look at this network, compare individual B in the upper left to individual D on the far right. Every dot's a person, every line between them is a friendship relationship. B and D have different number of friends. That's known as the degree of a node. So some people have 4 friends, some people have 6 friends. People vary in how many friends they have. Now look at individuals A and B. A and B have the same number of friends, but they have there's the difference between the two of them is whether their friends know each other. So A's friends are friends with each other. So a friend of A's is right back again a friend of A's. And a friend of B's is not a friend of B's. And we think the reason for this variation, in fact, is that there's evolutionary advantage sometimes to being interconnected and sometimes not. If you wanted to hunt a mastodon, who would you rather be, A or B? A. All your friends know each other, we can get together, we can go kill the thing. But if you wanted to find a mastodon, you would rather be B. Because in A, your friends' friends are back your friends again. They don't have any special information about where the mastodon might be. Whereas B's friends' are more distantly located in the network. And if you consider C and D, imagine they both have 6 friends, but now with this bird's eye view, we can see that C has a different structural location than D. So imagine that a deadly germ were spreading through the network. Who would you rather be, C or D? You'd rather be D, on the edge of the network. Individual C is going to be buffeted on all sides by this pathogen that's spreading. But now imagine that a juicy piece of gossip were spreading through the network. Now who would you rather be? C. So whether it's to your advantage to be on the middle or on the edge depends in part on what exactly is spreading. And when we did some experiments to look at this, we found that all 3 of those things, the degree, the transitivity, which is whether your friends know each other or not, and the centrality are partially genetically heritable. So we find that 46% of the variation in the number of friends people have is explained by their genes. And that's not too surprising. Some of us are born shy and some are born gregarious. So that sort of makes sense. But in addition, we find that 47% of the variation in whether your friends know each other depends on your genes. This is very bizarre. What I'm telling you is that if Tom, Dick, and Harry are in a room, whether Dick is friends with Harry depends on Tom's genes. Not just on Dick's and Harry's preferences, but on Tom's preferences. And we think the reason for this is that some people like to introduce all their friends to each other, and some do not. That there is this variation in people's interest in knitting together the networks around them. And finally, even the centrality, whether you're in the middle or on the edge of a network, also is partially explained by your genes. About 29% of the variation in whether you're in the middle or on the edge depends on your genes. Now, and so where you are in this vast fabric of humanity is partially, not completely, partially genetic. Now, people don't just have one kind of relationship with each other, they can have many. And new technology can affect this, at least in some ways. And this in turn begs the question of whether our online worlds resemble the offline worlds. And here's a network of 105 people, and each of the people in this network has about 6 close friends, as shown by the lines. And this is what it looks like when you add their clubs, their members, these are students, whether they're members of the same club or not. And here is whether the blue lines are whether they're roommates. It's actually a problem if you're roommates with someone who's not your friend, but that happens a lot here. And here's what happens when you add their Facebook friends. So, because the average person on Facebook will have hundreds of, quote, friends, even though they have a much smaller number of real interactions. And in fact, we can broaden the network and study the whole sample of 1,700 students in this class, and you get a vastly complicated set of interactions in this online world. But this profusion of data can be overwhelming. And for both analytic and conceptual reasons, we need a way to discern which of these ties is a real social connection, not just the kind of Facebook acquaintance, as it were. And in fact, we find that Facebook friends and other online ties are very tenuous, not surprisingly, and we wondered whether they could influence us in the same way as real face-to-face connections. So to exploit our data, what we did is we looked at the photographs that people post online and that they tag, and we said, okay, if you take a picture of yourself with someone else, you clearly know them face-to-face, post it on your website and tag it, that's a more special kind of friendship than the random people that you interact with online. We call those picture friends. And we mapped networks of picture friends using the Facebook data to see whether or not there was influence on various processes. For instance, we looked at taste in movies and books and so forth, and we found that if your random acquaintances on Facebook adopt a taste in a movie or a music or a book, it doesn't affect you, but if your picture friends do, it does. And while we were looking at these picture friends, we also coded whether or not people were smiling to kind of recapitulate that offline work that we showed you. Here now is a network of 336 students, and we code in blue whether people are frowning, yellow if they're smiling on their Facebook profile photo, and green in between. And again, you can see clusters of smilers and non-smilers, and you see that the smilers are more likely to be in the middle of the network, the frowners are more likely to be on the periphery, and the smilers, it turns out, have 20% more friends than the non-smilers. Now, so I'd like to then close with just a few remarks about the point of a connected life. Why, if it's in fact partially genetic, what's the point of a connected life? I mean, why do we live out our lives not just in groups, but also in networks? How does it help us? Well, it turns out that networks have value. They're a kind of social capital. And new properties emerge because of the connections, because of the ties between us. When we assemble ourselves into networks, and in particular when we assemble ourselves into particular kinds of networks, our networks are able to do things that the individuals within them could not. So think about these two objects. They're both made of carbon. They have the exact same constituent element, and yet they have totally different properties depending on how the carbon atoms are connected. So if you connect the carbon atoms one way, you get graphite, which is dark and soft. And if you connect the carbon atoms another way, you get diamond, which is clear and hard. Totally different properties that do not inhere, do not reside in the carbon atoms, but rather emerge and arise as a result of the pattern of interconnections between the atoms. So these two forms of carbon, are able to do very different things depending on the pattern of ties between them. So it is not just what's happening in the people around you, whether they are happy or rich or thin, for instance, that matters. It's also the actual structure of the network around you, independent of what's happening around you, that's also important. The shape of the network, near and far, to us, can have significant implications for how we live out our lives. Here's just one example borrowed from some work by my colleague, Brian Uzzi, who's a sociologist at the Kellogg School at Northwestern at Chicago. He looked at production companies for Broadway musicals. So the question was, what makes some Broadway musicals a big success and other Broadway musicals a flop? And what Brian did was he took networks of people who were producing shows, and he mapped the structure of the networks. And on the far left, you can see a single individual, maybe the director, and 5 people around him or her. And among those 5 people, there are 5 times 4 divided by 2, 10 possible ties or relationships that could exist. And in the far left, none of those relationships exist. There's very low transitivity or density. And on the far right, you see that all 10 of those ties exist. And what Uzzi found is that if nobody had worked together before, there was 0% transitivity or 0% density. In the production company, the show was a flop. And at the other extreme, if everybody had worked together before, the show was a flop, both commercially and in terms of critical review. But in the middle, when you had middle transitivity, some of the people knew each other and had worked together before, and some did not. The show was both a commercial and a critical success. And on the far right, we plot the density which is something like the transitivity, on the x-axis, and the success rate on the y-axis, and you see this parabolic relationship where the structure of the network of these people working together affects the quality of the work they're able to produce. And similar work has been done with collaborations among scientists and other individuals when you get the right mix together. And I think the reason is, in part, you need just the right number of people who've worked together before so they can collaborate.